to Blitzscaling, a
No,
podcast. I am
Blitzscaling a
Julien Newman.
startup. The Blitzscaling a
Sorry.
startup podcast.
Blitzscaling, a startup, the podcast. Yes, sorry. I'm Julien Newman.
And I'm Chris Yeh.
All right. So, Chris, we're discussing today a topic that's, I feel, very not talked about, or rather,
Mm-hmm.
like, you get one advice, but it's clearly not what everyone's doing. And clearly, obviously, not the right fit for everyone. Like any advice, just co-founders
Yeah.
should you have them. And the advice that you get across the board is yes, you should have co-founders. Like to the point that let's say like Y Combinator, I think pretty much won't take you if you don't have co-founders. And it's not just them. Like let's say I know Reed, Hoffman really encourages people to have co-founders,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not what everybody does. So the Jeff Bezos didn't have a co-founder. I think Mark Zuckerberg technically did, but in the end, they all kind of flaked out and like left, and he ended up just building the company himself. I mean, his co-founders are his investors, really. And I have multiple friends who are really strong founders who don't have co-founders. So it occurs to me that okay, well, this is not the only model, and I guess the like what is the case for, and what is a case against? At a high level,
Mm-hmm.
co-founders.
All right. So let's talk about why people usually give the advice that you should have a co-founder. And that's because most people do better with a co-founder for a variety of reasons. And we'll explore those reasons for a second. The first and obvious reason is that co-founders can have complementary skills. And it is often the case that you'll have one co-founder who's more technical, one co-founder who is more outward facing, classic Ms. inside, Ms. outside kind of approach. Because it's very rare that somebody is both a genius technologist and a brilliant storyteller all at the same time. And we see this archetype happen over and over again. With Apple Computer, you have Steve Wozniak, the technology genius, and Steve Jobs, the more or less business genius. And they were, in fact, co-founders. Or if you look at Google, well, that's another interesting one because you had Larry Page and Sergey Brin. And it wasn't that Larry or Sergey was necessarily less talented or less technical than the other. So we're going to return to that one as an example of category two. But the first is just you get more skills with two people than one if those two people are complementary. The second, which is also important, is that psychologically, it is very difficult for people to be solo founders. And it may be that the boost to the chances of success you get from having a partner in the process is worth any dilution you take along the way. And Larry and Sergey are a great example of this. If you talk to people about Larry and Sergey of Google, what everyone will tell you is that Larry Page has always been the one in charge, the alpha, if you will. And Sergey is the more laid back guy who goes with the flow. But Larry didn't want to start the company without Sergey. He didn't want to go it alone. He wanted to have the benefit of having his friend with him, helping him along with skills that could add to what he was doing, of course. And they never have seemed to have regretted it. They remain friends to this day, super close. And that's fine, right? And I think that this is the attitude that I often have. So when I was starting Blitzscaling Ventures, one of my friends who comes from the private equity world said, hey, why are you bothering to have partners at all? You are the brand name above the marquee. You could just go ahead and do this yourself, maybe hire a couple of associates to do the work if you want, and keep all the upside. And my response to that was that would be true if I thought my chances of success would be equal in both cases. And I think that there is benefit to having people on board with complementary skills. My partner, Scott Johnson, for example, has 20 plus years of experience as a venture capitalist. That was useful in terms of raising money and also in terms of operating the fund. But the other is that I do not view life as a zero-sum game. And in the case of a venture fund, it definitely isn't, because if you can raise a larger fund, then you can just invest more money and you can have more upside for everyone. And I would rather bring people along for my success than travel that road by myself. So those are the two primary reasons, the skill-based reason and the psychological-based reason. Now, not all founders have that kind of psychology. You mentioned Reid Hoffman. Reid wanted to have that. Guess what? Reid, like me, is a very people-oriented person who is super loyal to his friends and likes to do things together. But there are other founders who don't, right? There are founders who are perfectly content to work on their own. I think that you have been able to solo found companies without much trouble. You're an independent guy. You don't need the reassurance or the comfort or security blanket of having someone around you. And that's why we see enormously successful solo founders. Although I would argue there are some extenuating circumstances. So in the case of Amazon, Jeff Bezos is the sole founder, but he had his wife, Mackenzie, along most steps of the way. He also did have an early technical, not co-founder, but early technical architect who didn't really have co-founder status per se, but was there at the very beginning when it was just him and Bezos.
Yeah.
So things that are quasi co-founder like in that case. Zuckerberg, as you mentioned, had co-founders, just they dropped out along the way, which sometimes happens. So I would say that you should not feel that you are bound to have a co-founder. You should not feel that the general rule of thumb necessarily applies to you, but you should have some pretty specific reasons why that general rule doesn't apply to you, some evidence that suggests that in fact it works before you take the step of saying, well, I'm unlike normal people and I would do better without a co-founder.
So I have a friend who, I won't name here, but kind of, who is starting his not his first business. He's been very successful in the past, and he doesn't have a co-founder. And I asked him, so my two businesses that I had co-founders. They're CTOs, so they were
right.
So I had the CEO role, and then I had someone else as the CTO, and I really liked my co-founders. I'd say I didn't find them helpful from a kind of like psychology perspective. And that's just my personality. Like I'm totally fine doing things alone. I did find it really helpful from a kind of like delegation perspective. Yeah. Like someone who's like incentivized as much as you are to make things successful.
Correct. And let's press on that for a second, because that is the thing that distinguishes a co-founder from everyone else. The thing about a co-founder is that they have similar incentives. In other words, a similar sense of ownership. And it is frustrating to be the person in the organization with the highest level and highest sense of ownership, where everyone else is on a completely different tier and nobody else is willing to make the sacrifices that you are.
Yeah, well, that's so that is, it's kind of like, so Eric was the co-founder of my last business, Dedicated, right? And like anything that Eric was doing, I just assume not necessarily that it would work out, but that it was going to be done seriously, and as well, like the outcome is going to be as good as it could be, and that Eric would just figure out the best way forward, because he was a smart guy, and he was mostly working on technical stuff, and he's very technical, and he's incentivized, and also Eric is just a great guy. So that's so that was, I think, what I found helpful. The psychology part, I think, was for me not that important. And so like you had like two reasons. One is kind of like division of labor, essentially, or like additional skills, which I think in my case did work. It was a case. And then the psychology part, I think, for me personally was less important. But so I spoke to this guy, I was about to say his name, but that very experienced founder, and he, like, I asked him, like, why don't you have co-founders? He said, well, my first business, I felt I needed co-founders because I needed the kind of emotional support, and this time I don't, because presumably it's the second business. So I assume his calculation is, hey, I don't need the psychological support, and I feel I have the necessary skills required and network of other people I can bring in to make this happen. Like, when is that a good argument, or when is that a good way of thinking about things?
Yeah. So here's how I would put it. One of the things you may have heard me say before is that success in the startup world is largely binary. You are either successful or you aren't. And if you are successful, having half the stock changes the size of the outcome, but doesn't really change the impact that it has on your life. And so, what that means is if you have co founders, you are reducing the size of the outcome if you are successful. But that is not really that big a difference in the utility curve of that money. And instead, if having co founders increases your chances of success, even if it doesn't double your chances of success, even if the expected value is not higher with having a co founder, it may be worth it to have a lower expected value projection with a co-founder because it increases the chance of success. So let's say your chance of success is increased 75%. It would need to increase 100% to make up for giving up half the equity. But you don't quite get there, but that's okay because having a 75% greater chance of a binary outcome is still worth it. And so the key question becomes, does having a co-founder, irrespective of dilution, increase my chances of success? And there are plenty of circumstances under which it would not. Maybe you can't find someone who is compatible enough, or maybe you are just so certain that you know what to do, that having someone arguing potentially the other side of the decision would be negative, would be just a drag and slow things down. And so those would be the circumstances under which I would say you don't need a co-founder, or you should avoid having a co-founder. However, if having a co-founder will increase your chances of success, then I find it very difficult to argue against it.
Okay, I think that makes sense. Like, the kind of model here is essentially outcomes are binary. What you want to do is optimize for and huge. So it's either nothing or it's everything. And the dilution isn't what matters. You need to just optimize for probability of success. And the way you think about co-founders is similar to how you think about venture funding, where it's like, it's not true that every VC dollar you take increases the likelihood of success. Like, maybe you're going to have a toxic board member or whatever. But if that VC money, or if that co-founder, or if that executive who's you have to do a lot of dilution to bring on, is going to increase the likelihood of success, of getting this amazing, huge success, then you should do it.
That's right. In other words, dilution is nonlinear. It is not simply a matter of expected value. It's a matter of risk-adjusted return, because while expected value maximization is great, we only have a limited number of opportunities to play this startup game. And the biggest danger is not, oh, I made less because I was diluted some. The biggest danger is I never had a win.
So the question then is, in what circumstances is having a co-founder increasing the likelihood of success? And maybe we can start with the ways in which it would decrease the likelihood of success. What are the ways that you know of that having a co-founder can decrease the likelihood of success?
Well, this is an interesting one because this starts to shed some light on the nature of the co-founder relationship. So the way it would probably, there are two ways I can think of that would decrease the chances of success, maybe three. The first way is, let's say that because you have a co-founder, you have to slow down decision making to get them on board. Speed is the essential characteristic of a startup. If you have to slow down a bunch as a result of having a co-founder, that could be very negative. I don't think this happens that often, right? Because the discussion between two people should not drag out for weeks and weeks and weeks. It should be relatively quick. And if you're both reasonable, you should be able to make a decision relatively quickly. The second is if having a co-founder causes you to make worse decisions. So not only are the decisions slower, but the decisions are worse. again, the question is, how could this occur? It would occur if, for whatever reason, you would go along with your co-founder, even though you know he or she was wrong, simply in order to get along. That's something that you can pretty much avoid as long as you're disciplined about it. But it also says that if you're in a co-founder relationship, it still needs to be clear who is making the final call. And obviously, you prefer it to be you. I would prefer it to be me under these circumstances. And so as long as you're still making the final call, you should not be making worse decisions with your co-founder. The final thing would be, and you mentioned this from a delegation standpoint, you had the positive case. When you delegated things to Eric, you knew it would be done well. If you have a co-founder to whom you delegate things and you know it won't be done well, then that is a problem. But that is solved by not co-founding a company with somebody who's incompetent to begin with. And that's why it doesn't make any sense to say, oh, I have to have a co-founder. No, not if it's an incompetent person. You should only bring a co-founder on board if they are actually additive to your chances of success. So to just quickly summarize, a co-founder could slow you down. But if you have the right relationship, it really shouldn't. A co-founder could cause you to make wrong decisions. But again, if you have ultimate decision-making control, that should not be the case. And if you have ultimate decision-making control, there certainly is a non-zero chance that you might be wrong sometimes. And your co-founder pointing out other possibilities, other reasons, might actually help you make better decisions. Historically, even though people warn about groupthink, the fact is that groups tend to make better decisions than individuals. And the final thing is, if your co-founder is incompetent, in which case I'd say, why the heck are they your co-founder?
So, okay, one element I wanted to bring up, I did want to dive into that more because there's like so much in there. It's super interesting. But that something you didn't touch on is like co-founder breakups or co-founder, infighting.
Right.
I've built 2 businesses and I've never had this problem. And my kind of like bias is to believe that that's, obviously avoidable. As a CEO of the company, that should be avoidable as long as your co-founder is mostly rational. And if that does happen, it's probably because your leadership sucks. That's my bias, but that is a thing that happens. And how should people think about that?
Well, you should avoid it if you can, but if you can't, there's always a way to negotiate it. I have been a part of negotiating multiple co-founder breakups. I have also been a part of preventing co-founding teams from breaking up. Done both of them. And sometimes it works out both ways. And that's okay. Right? At the end of the day, you can generally find a way to reach an amicable decision. So what you usually have to do is you usually have to buy the person off. The fact is, here's the reason why it's not good to have to break up with a co-founder. It's a waste of time, and you're going to have to waste some equity because to make them go away, you have to give them something. And they're not just going to go away with nothing. You got to give them more than they would get if they just left. And what you're doing is you're buying their compliance in the form of some sort of separation agreement and also in the form of them having incentive for the company to succeed. So that's why you want to avoid it, because it's an unnecessary cost and an unnecessary hassle. And yet you can almost always come up with a price that makes sense, unless the co-founders just hate each other at that point, in which case one of them might just destroy the company out of spite. I've never experienced that. I think that it takes a remarkably irrational and insane person for that to happen, but I know it does.
Yeah. So I think the kind of takeaway is functionally assuming like you should just ignore this as a factor, which the reason you should ignore it is that you just assume that you're going to be a competent leader. And as a competent leader, it is possible that there be a co-founder breakup because of legitimate disagreements or changes in people's lives. So let's say Eric, my co-founder, had a kid while we were building Dedicated, and that makes them not a fit for me to start another company with. And it could have been a reason for us to stop building a company together, but that ended up not being a factor. But there are legitimate factors, but you should ignore it when you're kind of deciding whether you want a co-founder or not, because if you have someone who's of high quality and you're a high quality leader, it'll be manageable in some manner. And if there's a breakup, like it'll be kind of manageable. It might cost you money and take time, but it's manageable.
Yeah, it ultimately is manageable. Again, this is why investors prefer co-founders who've known each other for a while, because they assume that if you've known each other for a while and work together, you're much less likely to break up. And I think that's true. In the Y Combinator policy you mentioned is responsible for some interesting outcomes. Drew Houston went into Y Combinator for Dropbox. He didn't have a co-founder. He basically found Arash off the streets. It worked out well, but gosh, that seems like kind of insane.
Okay, so cool. I'm happy we got that out of the way. Really the factors you brought up as the important factors is really about quality of person that you're recruiting, right? So it's like, can this person be a thought partner? Are they competent in execution? Are they able to like structure, like are they able to work with you with somebody, right? Not just necessarily you, but generally in a team in a functional manner where it can be agreed. It's like, hey, you're not the person making the final call, someone else is, whatever. And okay, in some ways, quality of individual is binary. So either you're of high quality or you're of low quality. But in other ways, it's also
I don't know about that.
It's also kind of on a spectrum.
Yeah. So there are different axes of quality. I mean, just immediately when you were talking about the quality, I thought, there's a couple of things. One is a person's individual skills. That's certainly one measure of quality. But the other measure of quality, which you touched on, is their ability to collaborate with others, which is a completely different axis. We all know people who are wildly competent, but wildly terrible when it comes to working with others. And then there's probably more axes as well that you get along the way in terms of speed and in terms of rigor, all sorts of other things. But the fact is, quality is not a single unitary metric. It is comprised of a whole variety of different characteristics. And you have to decide which of those are more important for your particular startup at that particular point in time.
Would it not be true that you can get a higher quality co-founder after you have de-risked the business?
Yes.
Somewhat.
Yes.
Right. So this kind of like concept that let's say I'd say like, Chris, do you want to found a company with me and we'll figure something out? And then we find something like, maybe that's the thing, that I did, but that I feel is wrong. And I think my intuition tells me, or my feeling is that, the further along you are, the more, de-risked it is, so you can be attractive to others, to high quality people. And also, the further along you are, what you are doing, and what is the right fit person. So actually, Eric, who is my co-founder for Dedicated, he was a perfect fit person for what I thought Dedicated would be when we started the business. And, others would have been a better fit for what the business ended up being. And
Yes.
That's just something we learned along the way. And maybe if I'd waited a year, I would have recruited a different person as a co-founder because I would have learned about the business. So
Right.
How do you think about timing for recruiting a co-founder?
So it depends on what your existing relationships are. So the scenario you outlined, where you sort of say, hey, let's work on something together, we'll figure out what it is as we go, is one that works if you have two highly skilled people with a history of collaborating successfully with each other, who have genuine love and affection for each other, right? When you team up like that, it almost doesn't matter what you do. It's more about the people that you're working with. And I think that is a very good model. The issue with that is that it may or may not be the case that you have that kind of relationship with that kind of person, right? If you are a first-time founder, are your friends going to say, wow, Julien or Chris is so talented and I'm so certain they're going to succeed, I'll follow them whatever they do? Or Is it more likely that they're going to wait and see and say, hey, I'm getting paid a huge amount of money right now to work for this company. I will join you when it becomes clearer that this is a good idea. So I think that it can work either way. If you have the ability to get someone on board as a co-founder who is the best person you could ever select, where you can't imagine having a better co-founder, just get them on board and get going. But if, on the other hand, you have something that's more common in the real world, which is to say this person is not on the top 5 of the people that you know to work that you want to work with, they're somewhere in the top 20. You're like, let's measure the fit. Let's figure out if I need to wait a bit and then figure out what to do. So, as you know, I have a number of friends in my life. So people like Reid Hoffman, of course, but also our mutual friend, Ben Kasnoka, my other friend, Ramit Sethi. And basically, these are folks where, if they wanted to do something together, I would just say, okay, let's go. Let's do it. We'll figure it out. But if I were to start a company from scratch and those kinds of folks were not available, and there were other folks who were available who had skills and who I'd work with, but were not necessarily proven to be among the best in the world at what they do, I might let things go along a bit before I decided who was going to be the co-founder and explore and make sure I really felt comfortable and confident.
Yeah, and one of the challenges as I think about this, so I think it is a challenge for first-time founders or like young people, right? So if, say you're like 21, what's the likelihood amazing technologists? Lower than if you're 30, let's say.
Right.
But another thing that happens is that people's lives change and there are different stages in their life. So let's say Eric, who is a co-founder of my last business, when we started the business, he was married but had no kids. Now he has a really good job. Like he's the head of the kind of generative AI kind of initiative in a leading big startup company. And he's paid huge amounts of money to do that. And he has an actual important position in that business, leading up an important initiative for them. And he has 2 kids and he needs money. And, he just went through a failed startup, so he doesn't have money. And it's just like not like if I was in his position, meaning like I had 2 kids and I would probably I would take a job that's paying a lot of money. His
decision is entirely rational, absolutely rational.
Correct. And I haven't talked to him about starting another business, but I wouldn't, because I assume even if he wanted to do it, he's not incentivized to do it, and it wouldn't be a smart move for us. Let's say if you're thinking about Ben Kasnoka, our common friend, he's heading up a VC fund. He just raised a new, bigger fund. Mm-hmm. He's not going to start a project with you. He's really busy doing something else. So it's like it's not just like, hey, do you have these relationships with people who respect you and want to work with you? It's also like, are these people in a stage of their life where they can and want to and are incentivized to participate in a project with you?
As I often say, is one of the issues you run into is when they go to start a company, all their friends are starting companies too. The friends that you have that are the absolute best at what they do are probably starting their own companies. And so it is rare that you are ever going to have a perfect team to go after something. And usually what I advise instead is, hey, pull together the best team you can, given the circumstances. You're often going to skew younger and less experienced and trade off potential for accomplishment. So you have people with extremely high potential because you cannot bring the people with extremely high accomplishment on board because they have the status, skills, and relationship to start their own companies.
Yeah. So I think the overall thing is, hey, you want to increase the likelihood of a successful outcome, and that means building the best possible team. And obviously, and there are different people who should fit into different slots. So you want the best possible early employees, the best possible co-founders, the best possible investors, and you want to assemble that team, in the manner that is realistic and at the time that is realistic, that you can actually do it. And you don't want to worry too much about dilution. You want to worry about quality, of team above all else, and worry less about dilution, less about timing, less about ego, and saying like, oh, I have all these people on my slide deck saying that I have a great team. It's more about just getting the highest quality people into the right slots.
Yeah, because in the end, even if you raise money, you still have to execute, right? Nobody's ever gotten rich just off of raising money. You got to actually build something of value. And to do that, you need great people.
Although I heard, I was talking to some people in Africa many years ago who were venture capital investors in Africa, and they had a common problem where people take their money and run away with it after they invested in their business.
That is something that will happen even in Silicon Valley. I remember one time encountering a company with a very charismatic CEO who I liked. And when he asked me to invest in his company, he's like, oh, we just need to have this additional cash on hand to be able to support this customer. I said, well, tell me about your existing investors. And I noticed that one of my friends had invested, and I just called him up and I just wrote him a message and said, hey, let's talk. And then he called me up and he sent me a text message back saying, we need to get on the phone. I'm like, aha, something's going on. And it turns out this person had stolen money, and they'd already hired forensic accountants to try to track down where the hell he took it. But he had created shell companies and siphoned money out of the company.
Really?
Yeah. This happens in Silicon Valley. Now, the founder was from somewhere else, but that doesn't matter. Everyone's from somewhere else here.
Those people do get rich off just raising, but yes. I don't think that's a path our listeners should be following or want to follow.
Yeah, you can only do it once. You can never come back to the United States.
Okay. There's a model that I came across, and one of my friends who started a leading, a very large Chinese startup. Okay, and well, really, what happens? There was a guy who was the CEO of that company, and he brought on two more junior people, including my friend, and he said, "Okay, you're each responsible for go-to-market." Like, so he was kind of like more, they're a hardware company, so he was doing kind of like the hardware component. And he's like, one guy is responsible for go-to-market in China, one guy is responsible for go-to-market globally, and the market where we take off, that's where we'll be focused as a business, and that's who will become the co-founder, and the other person will not be the co-founder. And so it was fun. It was a strange model where it's kind of like you have these two people competing for the co-founder role. What do you think of that model?
I think it's a terrible idea, an absolutely terrible idea. I think that you're trying to get a team of people to work together. Pitting them against each other is some Larry Ellison style shit that is just a bad idea. Now, there is a kernel of something interesting there, which is that vesting and ownership does not have to be determined up front and the same for everyone. And so it is entirely possible to create some sort of vesting schedule that's based on achieving milestones instead of just the passage of time. And so if that's the case, you can come up with clever ways to provide incentives such that people only get the sort of co-founder ownership if they achieve certain milestones. That's certainly possible. But the last thing I would say is that co-founder status is something that can be negotiated after the fact as well. So I had friends who started a company that ended up being very successful. And there were really just three co-founders. There were three co-founders who got together and made the company happen. But if you talk to folks about the company, there's like 5 or 6 people who list themselves as co-founders of the company. And that's done with the consent of the 3 real founders who are like, hey, you really delivered above and beyond. And you did a great job for us. And therefore, we're okay with you listing yourselves as a co-founder of the company, even though you weren't there at the very beginning. And it's a very easy honor to give out doesn't cost you anything, and may be very helpful to someone. And if they deserve it, why not? There's another essay that Reed and I wrote together about multiple founding moments of companies, which basically says, if somebody comes in at a refounding moment for the company, you may very well Dre is on. Oh my gosh, Dre, so good to have you on. If you have multiple founding moments, you may have co-founders who come in long after the company is established. Reed has always said that Jeff Weiner, who came in and helped refound LinkedIn, deserves to be considered a co-founder of the company, and Reed considers him as such. I'm not sure if the rest of the world has listened to Reed on this one, but it is a reflection of the fact that co-founder doesn't just have to mean you were there at the very beginning and you had the largest possible share of the equity. It can be an honor that is bestowed like a knighthood on the deserving.
So, good segue into the other topic I want to talk about, which is we're kind of like assuming here that there are two co-founders, which is what I've always done.
Mm-hmm.
But there are businesses that have a lot of co-founders. Like I have a friend who I think there are 5 co-founders.
Yep.
What is up with that? Like why would people do that? And what are the benefits and what are the downsides?
So usually it's very bad, unless some of those are is when it is 4 to 6 This is like the worst of all possible worlds. You have all these talented people, but their skills are largely overlapping. They have to make up a bunch of random titles so that this person's CEO, this person's president, this one's executive vice president, and so on and so forth, because of the egos involved. And I'm just like, this is not going to work. There's not enough equity to go around. You guys aren't all going to be able to add that value because you are too similar. So that is a huge red flag. So the companies, like I mentioned, my friend's company where there were 3 founders and then later there were like 5 or 6 co-founders, that's fine because those people were not initially co-founders. They were doing other things. And so the idea that you have a team of 6 people who are all going to get a significant share, who all have these fancy titles, I find it to be very, very bad. So I think that when you have a giant co-founding team, unless you guys have clearly done this before at a previous company in all those same or nearly the same exact roles, it's a red flag.
But 3 would be okay in your mind, right? It's like 2 or 3 is appropriate.
2 or 3 is appropriate. I mean, most people would say 2 or 3 is ideal. 2 is probably the platonic ideal, but 3 also works because with 2 you have inside outside. With 3 you could have something like business, software development, operations, or something like that, right? You can really build a power trio relatively easily.
Yeah, that's it. Like I have a friend, him and his co-founders started 2 businesses together. And they were 3. So this guy is like the operations person, so COO. Mm-hmm. So he just like ran the business. Then there was a CTO, ran the technology side. And I think the CEO, I never actually met him, but the CEO would do a normal CEO job, meaning he had no responsibilities, and he would do fundraising and recruiting, and strategy, and that feels like a good structure where you have like a kind of person who does the kind of work that the CEO needs, like ends up doing, and then somebody who does this work that the CEO needs to do. So I can see how that would work.
Yeah. And again, what this all reveals is that it's very case by case. Depends on the skills of the individual people involved. A solo founder can work. 2 people can work. A trio can work. You could even theoretically have 4 or 5 co-founders if their roles were very clear. And there's a famous saying, I can't remember who first said it to me, so I can't credit them, but I love it, which is co-founder conflict occurs when people want the same thing or people want different things. And what it means is co-founder conflict occurs when people want the same thing. They want the same role. They want the same title. They want the same glory. They want the same magazine interviews and things like that. Or co-founder conflict occurs when people want different things. They want to push the company in very different directions. They want to have very different roles. But if you have a team of people who have worked together before, this person's the CEO, this person's the CTO, this person's the VP of engineering, this person's the head of operations, this person is the head of sales, and they just work together because they've done it before, that's fine. And by the way, they're not going to have an even split.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Last question, and then I wanted to get the kind of like counter argument to what we've been saying. So it's like, what would be the strong argument against co-founders? But I have a question first, which is,
Yes.
And what it is, it's like the case of Mark Andreessen, or the case of like Netscape, where you had a really senior founder, and then you had Mark Andreessen, who was like 19 or really young. I think he was like a student at the time. And the reason I bring this up is actually like I'm not that, but I'm definitely getting older, right? Like I'm almost 35, and it is possible for me to get people now who are competent, but much, much younger than me. And should I be looking for people who are of the same level of experience, more experienced, or is it okay to have co-founders who are like 21?
I think it's okay to have co-founders who are 21. Look, there's a meta point, and then I'm going to talk about Netscape. The meta point is, when is it okay not to have co-founders, or when should you not seek co-founders? When you don't have the existing relationships. Right? If you don't have the existing relationships, developing them and then starting a company slows you down. So you should always be developing relationships with potential co-founders, so that when the time comes, you have a variety of different options that you could roll with in order to start your company. Because if you don't have that, you should not go out there and bring in strangers as co-founders. This is a bad idea. Even friends of friends are not enough because you don't know them well enough. Now let's talk about Netscape. What happened in the case of Netscape is that Mark Andreessen was at the team at the National Computing, Supercomputing, so whatever it was, NCSA, who was Mosaic, the first practical web browser.
Yeah.
And Jim Clark, who was a very experienced executive, had founded and run Silicon Graphics, came in, and he and Mark Andreessen were the co-founders of Netscape. And I believe it was an 80-20 split. Jim Clark got 80%, Mark Andreessen got 20%. Jim Clark, of course, was the one who was bringing the credibility, the ability to raise money from Kleiner Perkins, and all these other things. And I don't think Mark Andreessen has ever particularly complained about it, right? He was a grad student at the time, and it made him immensely wealthy. It made him hundreds of millions of dollars. So he's not complained about it. But the key thing to note about this is that Jim Clark co-founded the company with Mark Andreessen, who it turns out has demonstrated over and over again he's one of the smartest guys in the world. So yeah, it's great to bring in a younger co-founder, but you better have someone who is really freaking smart.
Yeah, it's a little bit like Palantir, right? Like, I don't know. Do you know the founding story of Palantir? Like, I know
Peter I don't know it as well.
The founders.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I'm not.
Joe Karp, I believe, is the other primary founder of Palantir. So I don't know the full story behind it, but I think it was similar to the sort of Jim Clark, Mark Andreessen story, right? Joe was a younger, less experienced guy, one of the Peter Thiel acolytes, but has proven to be enormously capable.
Yeah, it's it, because Joe Lonsdale was one of the founders, and he was really young. And then they also have a guy who's a current CEO. I don't know, and Peter Thiel. I don't know how involved Peter Thiel was. Okay, we have a comment here. What if So it's from Andres Alvarez, who you know, Chris.
Yes.
What if Jay-Z with Nets style co-founder, 1% equity and fancy title, but really just there for optics or LinkedIn status?
Yeah, so it's okay to have those kinds of fake co-founders. One of the things I said was you can have more founders or co-founders as long as they're fake co-founders. And that is a great example. Everyone says, oh, wow, Jay-Z is the owner of the Nets, but he only owned 1% of the equity. Or Magic Johnson's the owner of the Lakers, and he had a single-digit percentage of the franchise. That's fine, right? And that's like saying that Name your celebrity or someone like
Yeah.
that is a co-founder. Although I will point out that there are cases like Ryan Reynolds, who is a celebrity who has a significant stake in the businesses that he's a part of and serves as more than just a figurehead. He's a primary pitch man, but also contributing to what they're doing. So fake co-founders are fine. Just don't confuse them for real co-founders. Faux founders.
Yeah.
Yes. Good line, Dre.
Yeah, well, so in my short stint in university, I studied with this guy. It's called Joshua Bengio, who is he's like one of the top computer scientists in the world, and he's like one of the founders or godfather or whatever of machine learning. And he co-founded a company, an AI company called Element AI. And they raised a ton of money because he was the co-founder. Actually, I went to their launch, and the head of Tencent Ventures was there, and I asked him, like, "Hey, why are you investing in this business?" He's like, "Oh, I just like we want to do AI, and then we saw Joshua Bengio, so we invested." But this guy, like, he's not doing, like, he did nothing. He just put his name and got, I don't know how much percent, but presumably not a lot. And that was it. So that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah. And by the way, one of the things we should do, Julien, when this episode drops, is to go ahead and use Dre's term faux founders with the appropriate attribution, of course, because I've never heard that particular formulation before. And I think that it has a catchy ring. It might take off.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dre. So, Chris, that wraps it up for us. And I guess thank you for being available. I know your travel schedule is crazy. Next week I am doing the episode with because you're traveling and
Yes, I will be in Washington D.C. in this case next week. Hopefully talking about the future of technology and innovation with investors and policymakers.
So you're much fancier than spending time with me. At this time of the year, you could be at the UN.
I haven't done that yet, but it may eventually happen.
All the cool people this time of year are all at the UN General Assembly. And actually, Sean Kelly, who will be sitting in for you as a host, is actually at the UN. So there you go. Maybe he can be your connection.
Well, as you know, I'm very fond of Sean and his work, so please do pass along my best to him when he comes in.
So, and for everyone, listening, Sean is, a prof at Harvard. He's a friend of Chris's and of mine, and he's a philosophy professor, one of the top living philosophers, probably the top kind of like active philosopher. The others are still alive, but they're like 90. So we're really excited to have him, sit in for Chris when Chris is in DC. And here I have a final comment here from Dre, who says, "Lol, yay, feel free to use," and we will use it. So
with attribution, of course.
With attribution.
Now, one of the things we should point out to folks who are on the live stream or listening to this podcast is that if you love the Blitzscaling a Startup podcast, there's ways to get involved, to get early access. Why don't you take them through that?
Yeah, well, actually, people who are members of our Patreon would have already known, even before you, Chris, that we were doing this this episode with Sean. So they are the first place that I do any updates or do anything is our Patreon. Even the notes, I sent you notes ahead of this today's episode, and several days before I sent them to you, I sent them to our Patreon. And folks often ask for background information, and I give it to them. So it's patreon.com/blitzscaling. The other ask is or kind of the call to action here is if folks have friends who are considering starting a business and maybe thinking about what to do about co-founders, please share this conversation with them, because we do this mostly be helpful to people. The more people we can be helpful to, the better. And then if you want to see, make sure that you see the episode of Sean next week, and you get alerted about that live stream and about the episode when it drops. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, or subscribe on YouTube, or like it. So that's my litany of calls to action.
Awesome. Well, it is so great, as always, Julien, to be here with you. Sorry I'll be missing the festivities next week, but I know everyone will love hearing you and Sean discussing whatever topic it is you're going to discuss.
Yeah, well, we're actually discussing some questions that come out of a New York Times opinion piece that he wrote. So very fancy, a lot of a fancy name dropping here. New York Times, United Nations, Harvard. So I feel very part of the in club now.
Well, I'll look forward to listening to that podcast on the Blitzscaling a Startup feed, which, of course, I am a loyal subscriber to, as everyone else on this who's listening in should be as well.
All right. Bye, Chris.
Thank you so much.